I read a novel in January that is possibly the most challenging book I'm going to read this year. Thankfully, a challenge often, not always, but often comes with a reward. And in this case, my reward for reading this challenging book is that it has changed and enriched every book I have read since finishing it. The book is Melville by Rodrigo Frazan, translated by Will Vanderheiden and published by Open Letter Books. And I read it because it was longlisted for the Republic of Consciousness Prize. And not only was it longlisted, it was shortlisted. And not only was it shortlisted, it won. It won the prize. Melville is the winner of this year's Republic of Consciousness Prize for the US and Canada. This won the whole kit and caboodle. Before I tell you how this has shaped my reading ever since, and it's not, I didn't read it that long ago, but I've read a lot of books since then because I read the whole long list for the Republic of Consciousness Prize, and this was early on in the list. So I've read a lot since then. So before I do that, I want to give you a little context about the prize and about this book. But before I give you that context, I want to know in the comments, tell me about a book that you maybe read recently, maybe read a long time ago, that has shaped everything you have read since finishing that book. Do you have any examples? I would love to know in the comments. Okay, so first some context. What is the Republic of Consciousness Prize? The Republic of Consciousness Prize is a literary prize that is dedicated to small presses and the boundary-pushing, groundbreaking fiction that they put out into the world for readers like you and me to discover. The original prize was started in the UK by prize founder Neil Griffiths, and 3 years ago, Laurie Feathers launched the prize in the US and Canada. I have read the full long list for the US and Canada for the past 3 years. This year's list was my favorite of all of the long lists that I've read so far. Every single book on that list is worthy of your attention. I'll leave a link to the list in the description below, and this year's winner is certainly worthy of the prize. Rodrigo Frazan, the author of Melville, is a writer who was born in Argentina and who has written, I believe, 11 works of fiction so far. He hinted in an interview at a couple other books coming out soon. 11 and growing. I think he currently lives in Barcelona, Spain. I think I read that somewhere. The translator of the book is Will Vanderheiden, as I mentioned, and I know so many of you are big readers of translated fiction, so I highly encourage you to check out interviews with Rodrigo Frazan. I'll leave a link to a few of them below because Frazan is so generous with his praise and his clear respect for both Will Vanderheiden, his translator, but also for the art of translation itself. He even went as far as in the Zoom event for the Republic of Consciousness Prize this year, he said something like, he is the original author of Melville, but Will Vanderheiden is the author of Melville in English. Like, that's how impactful translation is on a work of writing. So I thought that was particularly generous and really a beautiful sentiment. Open Letter Books, which published Melville, is the University of Rochester's nonprofit press that is exclusively focused on translated literature. So talking about those translated works, this is the place to go if you are interested in literature from around the world that has been translated into English. Open Letter recently joined forces with Deep Vellum, which is another small literary press based in Dallas, Texas. Deep Vellum, from what I understand, will take on the role of publishing, distribution, and marketing responsibilities for Open Letter, while the editorial direction will remain with Open Letter's founder, Chad Post. So very cool. Deep Vellum is another amazing publisher, which now has a number of imprints that they've acquired that are just incredible presses in their own right. If you take one thing away from this video, one thing, it is to go check out Open Letter's website and their catalog, because the entire point of the Republic of Consciousness Prize is to celebrate small presses. So if you take one thing away, if you do one thing after this video, I want you to go check out Open Letter's website. You can see all of their books by country, which is really cool. So definitely check that out. And I hope you find something, check out Melville, check out their whole catalog, and I know that you will find something cool to read. So the book itself. The book, you guessed it, is about Herman Melville, American writer who needs little to no introduction, Hopefully he wrote Moby Dick. Yeah, so this book is about Herman Melville. In fact, it is narrated mostly by Herman Melville. But if you look closely at the cover, you might have noticed that the little E at the end of Melville has been cut off. And that is because this book is not just about Herman Melville. This is about his father, Alan Melville, as well. And Alan Melville spelled his last name without an E. Alan Melville died in 1832 when Herman was 12 years old. He died after a journey home one very frigid December, during which he had to cross the frozen Hudson River. And after returning home, Alan quickly became very, very ill. He eventually descended into a sort of delirium and madness due to his illness, and he died about a month or so after returning home. Alan Melville was, by all accounts, a failed businessman who had racked up a lot of debt in the course of his business dealings. And it is possible that Herman Melville's mother added the E to the name Melville in order to avoid the debt collectors coming after them after Alan's death. So that's the implication that's made by this novel anyway. And in some of the interviews that I've listened to with Faison, he's mentioned that that's a possibility for why the E kind of suddenly appears on the family's name. So this novel is about Herman and his father, and throughout the novel, Herman tells the story of his father's life and death, while also telling much about his own life, Herman's life, and his work and his writing. It's told in 3 sections. The first and the third section are narrated by Herman, and the middle section is narrated by Alan. And in this, Alan, so Herman's father, and in this section, we're kind of intended to imagine Alan on his deathbed. In fact, he's strapped down to his deathbed because he's in this delirious state. And he is narrating a delirious fever dream version of his life to young Herman, who is listening at the foot of the bed and is then presumably writing it down. And that becomes the middle section of this book. It's very much a fever dream section. A few things I loved about this novel. Time works in really interesting ways. The book takes place well over 100 years ago, but both Herman and Alan have knowledge of the future. They refer to books and events and scientific discoveries that happen well after both of their deaths. The reason that stood out to me is because it is a recurring theme on the long list for this year's Republic of Consciousness Prize. There were at least 2 other books that were set way in the past, but have had narrators who had knowledge of far into the future. And those 2 other books were Lublin and The Case of Jem. And it's just one of those fun parallels that you get to notice when you take on the job of reading a full long list. These weird little things that come up in different books. Another thing I loved, this is a book with extensive footnotes. And in fact, I felt like all of the meatiest stuff and all of the clearest and best ideas that I took from this book were all in the footnotes. They are a joy to read, so don't skip over them. They are in tiny print, but they are a joy. One example, this is Herman talking. Know this, ghosts live in books. No house can consider itself really and truly possessed and haunted if it doesn't have a respectable library to respect and on occasion to terrorize the people who live there, with the fact that the horror of everything they'll never read will always surpass the joy of the great deal they have read. Maybe I'll do a separate video sometime about footnotes and asides and parentheses, because I really love it when the most valuable insights are kind of tacked on to something as an aside. And I think this happens a lot in life and literature. So I might do another video sometime about footnotes and asides. If you're interested, let me know in the comments. I told you earlier that this book has changed how I've read everything that I've read since finishing it. This book is complex. It's rather dense in detail and things like literary references. It contains a whole section that is one long fever dream. So it is a challenging book, but it is a challenging book with a very simple takeaway. And that is, stories are powerful. and storytellers wield an immense power. A power to remake reality, a power to create truth, a power even to conquer death. Everything and anything is at a storyteller's disposal to take and remake. Herman Melville, the narrator, uses story in this story to remake the reality of his father's death. Rodrigo Frazan uses story to imagine what Herman Melville might have imagined about his father's life. Herman and Alan are dead. They are dead. There is no disputing that. But their story lives on. So does what really happened to Herman and Alan in their lives matter if what lives on in the end is the story? Story has the power to change reality and to become reality. That is a powerful takeaway from this book, but it isn't even exactly what has changed my reading going forward. What has changed my reading going forward since finishing this book is this simple quote. In the end, it's not the parents who write their children, but the children who rewrite their parents. I have been thinking about that quote and variations on that quote every time I pick up a book because it reappears in so many various forms in fiction all the time. So parents are the authors of their children, right? So biologically, I am not a scientist, so I'm not going to phrase this correctly, but like biologically, a parent's genes like write the genes of their children. So parents write their children biologically, but also how parents raise or don't raise their children, what experiences or values or lessons they give them or don't give them, whether they are good or bad, could be seen as writing their children. As in it could be seen as creating who their children are and will be. That is something that you certainly see all the time in fiction. But then children also in many ways rewrite their parents. So that could mean, having a child, I think, changes who you are. It rewrites you in a way. I feel that as a parent, that I feel rewritten a bit by just the fact of raising a child. But also, I think children often have to create a story about who their parents are in order to understand them. And we saw that exactly in one of the other shortlisted books for the Republic of Consciousness Prize, Like a Sky Inside, and I'll link my review of that book below. So in that book, the narrator had to rewrite her father very literally and just kind of imaginatively. She had to rewrite her father because he had hidden his original self so well from her. So she had to rewrite him. And writers in particular, I think, are often constantly rewriting their parents within their work, whether they realize it or not. The implication is made in Melville, even, that Herman Melville recreated versions of his father, Alan, in some of his fiction. He rewrote his father. It didn't say it was his father, but elements of his father were rewritten into his books. That implication is made in this book by Rodrigo Frazan. And finally, I also see the parent and the child in this quote as possibly a writer and that writer's inspiration or precursor or forerunner. So as in Herman Melville, the writer, could be seen as a parent to Rodrigo Frazan, the writer. Melville kind of wrote Frazan as like one of Frazan's biggest inspirations and role models, I guess, as a writer. Melville wrote Frazan as in created who Frazan is as a writer today. And therefore, Frazan will continuously rewrite Melville within his own work as kind of a child of Melville and his writing, and a child of all the different inspirations, all the different artists and writers who have inspired him over the years. He will continuously rewrite versions of those parents in his own work. And another quote from Melville, it's like just a little snippet. A son telling the tale the father will never tell. And that is, in the book, that is Herman Melville telling the tale of Alan Melville that Alan Melville will never get to tell for himself. But it's also Frazan telling the tale of Herman's relationship with Alan that Herman will never get to tell himself. So Farzan is kind of like a child of Melville if you consider Melville's work to be part of the creation or origin story of Farzan as an author. And honestly, I cannot stop thinking about that every time I read anything anymore. I'm ruined. I am ruined. Every book since I've finished this one has had notes, Melville, Melville, Melville in the margins. And indeed, if you listen to some of those interviews I'll link below with Farzan, he talks about how Moby Dick was a work that somehow contains everything that came before it, all the precursors, every piece of fiction that came before Moby Dick is contained within Moby Dick. But then also Moby Dick predicts everything that comes after it. Every kind of writing, every kind of art that comes after it is predicted in Moby Dick. So again, brilliant book. If you are up for the challenge, I highly recommend it. I highly recommend any book on the long list for the Republic of Consciousness Prize this year. Any book on the short list, check them out. I'll be back later with the final 3 reviews of the other 3 shortlisted books from this year's shortlist, which will include what was my favorite book on the shortlist, which, as brilliant as this was, and as much as it has changed my reading ever since, it wasn't even my favorite on the shortlist. So come back to see which one that was. Or actually watch my long list video, because I actually tell you. Check out Open Letter. Check out my other videos on my channel if you like this kind of stuff. I talk exclusively about indie and nonprofit publishers and the amazing works that they put out into the world on this channel. So stick around if you're into that. My name is Sarah. Thank you so much for joining me. Bye.